Good evening. It's Friday, August 14th. The U.S. Post Office warns nearly every state in the union that it could not guarantee that all mail-in ballots to be cast in the November election will be delivered in time to be counted. That's music to the ears of President Trump, who fears the vote by mail will cost him re-election. His hand-picked Postmaster General is busy cutting postal service in the guise of cutting costs. Tens of thousands of people again flood the heart of the Belarus capital of Minsk in a show of anger over a brutal police crackdown on peaceful protesters that followed an election they claimed was rigged to keep authoritarian President Alexander Lukashenko in power. A heat wave that began today in California and is expected to last through next week brings dangerously high temperatures, increased wildfire danger, and fears of coronavirus spread as people flock to beaches and parks for some relief. It's also taxing the state's power grid, which is on the brink of rolling blackouts. A new report shows the pandemic-related unemployment crisis could mean eviction for more than 40% of the third of Americans who rent their homes. The Ninth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals throws out California's ban on high-capacity ammunition magazines, ruling the law banning devices holding more than 10 bullets violates the constitutional right to bear firearms. Gun groups call it a huge victory. And a white Georgia state trooper is fired and charged with murder after he shot a 60-year-old black man who tried to flee a rural traffic stop. From Pacifica, KPFA in Berkeley, KPFK in Los Angeles, this is the Evening News. I'm Mark Merkel. A Washington Post reports today that the U.S. Postal Service has sent letters to 46 states and the District of Columbia warning it cannot guarantee all ballots cast by mail for the November election will arrive in time to be counted. The Postal Service is bracing for an unprecedented number of mail-in ballots as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. But at the same time, the need for timely delivery of the mail is peaking. Service at the letter delivery agency has been curtailed amid a series of measures implemented by its new leader. Postmaster General Louis DeJoy, a former supply chain CEO and a major donor to President Donald Trump and other Republicans, has pushed what he says are cost-cutting measures to eliminate overtime pay and holds mail until the next day if postal distribution centers are running late. DeJoy is the first pure political appointee in years to be named Postmaster General and has millions of dollars invested in firms competing with the Postal Service. The revelation that some voters could be disenfranchised comes amid a campaign by Trump to sow doubts about the election. Though Trump casts his own ballot by mail, he's railed against efforts to allow more people to do so, which he claims, in the face of evidence to the contrary, that it will lead to increased voter fraud. The letters obtained by the Washington Post raise the possibility that tens of millions of Americans eligible for mail-in ballot status this fall will not be able to use it, even if they follow election rules. One such letter, which was obtained by the Associated Press, warned Michigan Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson that the agency might not be able to deliver ballots in time to be counted under the state's deadlines for casting mail-in votes. The state of Pennsylvania has also gotten such a warning. Sarah Walton reports.
In a letter to the official overseeing Pennsylvania's elections, the USPS says that allowing people to request a postal vote just a week before the November 3rd election doesn't give mail workers enough turnaround time. and that many ballots may not reach their destination. It's thought a record number of people will use mail-in voting this year because of the pandemic. But President Trump has claimed, without evidence, that it will lead to mass voter fraud. Critics blame a recent slowdown in deliveries on policies brought in by his appointee to oversee the Postal Service. Trump won Pennsylvania by less than 1% in 2016, and it's widely seen as a key battleground state this year. I'm Sarah Walton in New York.
New Jersey's governor says the state will move to a nearly all-male election this November, following the model it used for the July primary because of the coronavirus. Democratic Governor Phil Murphy said during an interview with CNN today that all voters would get a ballot. It's not clear if people who aren't registered will get an application to register. Murphy indicated the only in-person voting will be with provisional ballots. That means if voters want to cast their ballots in person, they'll have to go to one of a reduced number of polling places and cast a ballot that will be counted only after officials determine the voter did not mail in another ballot. If the July 7th primary model is used, voters can mail back their ballots to county boards of elections, deliver them there in person, or use one of 5 drop boxes across the county. Operational changes in the Postal Service, ostensibly intended to help the financially troubled agencies save money, aren't going over well with some small business owners in Missouri and in other states. Mary Sherman reports.
Recent modifications, including the end of overtime for workers, have led to numerous reports of delays, both in personal and commercial mail and package delivery. Chairman of the Package Coalition, John McHugh, says there is legitimate concern about the viability of some small businesses if these problems linger during what's expected to be a challenging economic recovery.
Package delivery for them is often vital. They have to get whatever it is they're making to their customers. They have to get from their suppliers whatever it is they need. And if that service is not available, what happens to those small businesses? They shut down. That's horrible for them.
Missouri has more than 523,000 small businesses. The Postmaster General said the cutbacks are needed to produce more efficiencies for the agency, which could lose roughly $11 billion this year. There have been growing calls for a federal rescue, but some Republicans, including President Donald Trump, have resisted that idea and favor privatization. Brad Jones with the National Federation of Independent Businesses in Missouri notes there are some communities where the Postal Service is their only delivery option.
The Postal Service in our rural areas are so important for your smaller businesses to be able to get out their billing, to be able to get out the marketing pieces that they need to get out, just to reach out to their existing clientele. It's extremely important.
Jones adds the one thing small business owners don't like is uncertainty.
Whether it be in their taxes, how much they're paying for health care, their delivery system, whatever it might be, uncertainty is never good in the small business world.
The U.S. Senate is considering a bipartisan bill that would provide up to $25 billion in emergency financial relief for the U.S. Postal Service. For Public News Service, I'm Mary Sherman.
A 3-judge panel of the 9th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals today threw out California's ban on high-capacity ammunition magazines, saying the law violates the U.S. Constitution's protection of the right to bear firearms. Even well-intentioned laws must pass constitutional muster, Appellate Judge Kenneth Lee wrote for the panel's majority. California's ban on magazines holding more than 10 bullets strikes at the core of the Second Amendment, the right to armed self-defense, he said. He noted that California passed the law in the wake of heart-wrenching and highly publicized mass shootings, but said that isn't enough to justify a ban whose scope, quote, is so sweeping that half of all magazines in America are now unlawful to own in California. California Attorney General Javier Becerra did not immediately say if he would ask the full appellate court to reconsider the ruling by the 3 judges or if he would appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. He also did not immediately say if the state would seek a delay of the ruling to prevent an immediate buying spree. Sales are currently on hold based on a stay by the lower court and cannot immediately resume. California Rifle and Pistol Association attorney Chuck Michel called it a huge victory for gun owners and the right to choose to own a firearm to defend your family. while a group that favors firearms restrictions called it dangerous and expects it will be overturned. The ruling has national implications because other states have similar restrictions, though it immediately applies only to Western states under the appeals court's jurisdiction. A congressional watchdog agency found that the top 2 Trump administration officials in the U.S. Department of Homeland Security are improperly appointed to their posts under federal law. The Government Accountability Office says acting DHS Secretary Chad Wolf and acting Deputy Ken Cuccinelli are ineligible to run the agency under the Vacancy Reform Act. The GAO says it has asked the DHS Inspector General to review their status and decide whether the apparent violation of the Vacancy Reform Act has any effect on their actions that they took while holding the post. Some could be declared unlawful. DHS rejected the finding. Meanwhile, according to Congressman Benny Thompson, who's chair of the House Committee on Homeland Security, and Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney of the House Committee on Oversight and Reform, Wolf should step down and return to the position he previously held in the department, and Cuccinelli should resign altogether. The 2 Democrats said in a joint statement that GAO's damning opinion paints a disturbing picture of the Trump administration playing fast and loose by bypassing the Senate confirmation process to install ideologues. Tens of thousands of people flooded the heart of the Belarus capital of Minsk today in a show of anger over a brutal police crackdown this week on peaceful protesters that followed a disputed election. And authorities sought to ease rising public fury by freeing at least 2,000 who had been jailed after earlier demonstrations. Factory workers marched across the city shouting, "Go away," in a call for authoritarian President Alexander Lukashenko to resign after 26 years of iron-fisted rule that was extended in an election on Sunday the protesters denounced as rigged. Thousands of factory workers who previously formed the core of Lukashenko's base have joined the protests, denouncing the police crackdown and demanding a new election, raising the prospect of a nationwide strike. As the protesters rallied on the square, Lukashenko dismissed them as puppets manipulated from abroad. During a meeting with top law enforcement officials, he defended the crackdown as a justified response to violence against police by some of the protesters. The Interior Ministry said 120 police officers had been injured. European Union foreign ministers met in Brussels and said they rejected the election results and tasked officials with drawing up a list of people in Belarus who could face sanctions over their role in the crackdown. They'll meet again later this month to consider imposing the sanctions. Reporter Tony Waterman in Brussels.
Fresh sanctions against Belarusian officials could be coming as soon as this month after EU foreign ministers laid the groundwork for another meeting later this month. The Polish minister said that most member states were in favor of sanctions targeting the individuals behind last Sunday's presidential election, which is widely seen as rigged, and also those responsible for the violent clashes with protesters. And that would make sense. It's the route that the EU has taken before with Belarus, and it's a way to ensure the people on the ground aren't negatively affected by sanctions. The next step will be drawing up that list of individuals and also deciding on what type of action to take. In the past, the EU has favored asset freezes and travel bans. In fact, 170 Belarusians, including the president, Alexander Lukashenko, only got off the blacklist in 2016. Tony Waterman.
And Tony Waterman was reporting from Brussels. Reporter Simon Marks has more.
taking a closer look today at the crisis in Belarus, sparked by President Alexander Lukashenko's attempts to rig the outcome of the country's election last weekend. That, in turn, led opposition candidate Svetlana Tikhanovskaya to flee Belarus and seek exile in Lithuania after her family was reportedly threatened by the Lukashenko regime. With protests growing, this could be a turning point for Belarus. The country has been dominated by Alexander Lukashenko, a former farm director, since 1994. But Veronika Laputska of the Eurasian States in Transition Research Center says time for him may be running out.
Basically, all the protesters were portrayed in the same way, as drug addicted, as drunk people, as people with no occupation. But more and more people, of course, understand that it is a blatant lie because thanks to the social media, people understand that this is not true, and people know that these people are just normal. They just want to be free, and they just want free elections, and they want their votes and their voices to be taken into consideration.
President Lukashenko calls his opponents sheep who are controlled by foreign governments. He continues to enjoy the support of Russian President Vladimir Putin, who sent the Belarusian leader a congratulatory message after he claimed victory in the disputed election on Monday. With FSN Spotlight, I'm Simon Marks.
You're listening to the evening news on KPFA Berkeley, KPFK Los Angeles, KFCF Fresno, online at kpfa.org. A heat wave that began today in California and is expected to last through next week brought dangerously high temperatures, increased wildfire danger, and fears of coronavirus spread as people flocked to beaches and parks for some relief. High pressure building over the western states pushed temperatures into triple digits across the state by midday. Sweltering weather was expected to continue into next Wednesday across greater Los Angeles, the Central Valley, Sierra Nevada foothills, and parts of the San Francisco Bay Area. Santa Clara, Alameda, and Contra Costa counties opened cooling centers that will welcome people this weekend from the afternoon to the early evening. San Francisco officials said the city is recommending people stay home and that if the heat indoors gets intolerable, to go outside to a shady place where people can stay cool and distant from other people. Los Angeles opened cooling centers, but with limited capacity because of coronavirus social distancing requirements. The California Independent System Operator, which manages the state's electric power grid, issued a statewide flex alert for today, calling for voluntary electricity conservation from 3 in the afternoon to 10 tonight, when there's expected to be higher demand, mainly from the use of air conditioners. People were asked to turn off unnecessary lights and avoid using major appliances, such as washing machines, during those hours. That apparently did not work, however. The independent service operator has now declared a Stage 2 statewide emergency and is reducing power to large electricity users which have agreed to voluntary cutbacks. That's prior to a Stage 3 emergency in which rotating power blackouts around the state would be imposed. In addition to the possibility of heat stroke and other hot weather illnesses, health officers are concerned that people will pack the beaches, lakes, and other recreation areas without following mask and social distancing orders, a major concern in a state that's seen more than 600,000 coronavirus cases. Israel saw a COVID-19 resurgence after a May heat wave there, inspired school officials to let children remove their masks. California has finished working through a backlog of coronavirus tests caused by a data snafu that cast doubt on the state's coronavirus pandemic numbers. Governor Gavin Newsom presented the new numbers today at his coronavirus briefing, and it was good news for California, with the number of new cases of COVID-19 plummeting to the lowest level in 7 weeks. Newsom discussed the national controversy over post office funding for mail-in voting this November and school preparations for distance learning and special needs students. Christopher Martinez reports.
Among all the controversies surrounding the pandemic and government responses, the United States Postal Service has emerged as something of a political football. While President Donald Trump has opposed postal funding that would help voting by mail, Governor Gavin Newsom is stepping up to defend the post office.
It's Americana, it's apple pie, and I'll throw in baseball.
Newsom spoke at his coronavirus update briefing at the state capitol, where he blasted Trump's approach as sabotage.
This is going to impact not just elections, it's going to impact your ability to get quality care in terms of your prescriptions, to get information, to be able to correspond with loved ones and the like. Vulnerable populations disproportionately being impacted because of their utilization of our postal system. I haven't experienced this in my lifetime. I don't know that any of us have. The weaponization of sorts of our postal system.
Newsom described a pair of executive orders he signed months ago that were later codified into law by the legislature. One provides 4 drop-off sites for people who cannot or don't want to mail their ballots. The other extends the timeline for mail-in ballots.
We have a provision that allows 17 days to collect ballots. If it's postmarked, we will give the ability for our registrars to get those things collected and, moreover, certified, but over a 17-day period. We thought that was important with all the uncertainty of COVID. We didn't realize how prescient, not just important, that now appears to have been with what has happened with some of what I would describe almost as vandalism of our postal system.
The bulk of Newsom's briefing was devoted to education, as California schools are beginning their new academic years. About 97% of those schools are opening up for distance learning. Newsom calls that suboptimal, but he says schools are using lessons learned over the summer, as well as bringing to bear funding from federal coronavirus relief legislation.
We used a disproportionate amount of that federal stimulus dollars, and we gave it to our education system this year for learning loss, focused on equity, focused on the lens of addressing the lessons we learned in spring in anticipation we may need to bring those lessons and closing that divide into the fall session. $5.3 billion.
Newsom and state education leaders talked about progress in acquiring computer equipment and setting up Wi-Fi hotspots to provide internet connectivity for students. They also talked about guidelines for students with acute needs. Linda Darling-Hammond is president of the State Board of Education. She says many school districts are getting ready to offer small group settings for some special needs students whose needs cannot be met online.
We are working through guidance with the California Department of Public Health that should be released this coming week that will allow school districts in collaboration and consultation with their local public health department to convene these small groups of students in safe ways that allow their needs to be met in person.
Newsom says the beginning of a school year is normally a time of excitement and anxiety. That's all the more true in these troubled times. State School Superintendent Tony Thurmond offers some advice.
These are clearly uncharted, waters. These are times where we don't know all of the answers, but there are some things that we know. The governor says it all the time. Wear a face covering, and that'll help to keep us safe and flatten the curve. We can't control what coronavirus does, but we can control how we respond to it. We wear a face covering, we wash our hands, we maintain physical distance, we give ourselves a fighting chance to reduce and prevent infection across our communities and certainly in our schools.
Reporting for Pacifica Radio News KPFA, I'm Christopher Martinez.
Florida's high school athletic board has voted to begin practices for football and other fall sports on August 24th and games less than 2 weeks later. The decision pushes aside the advice of medical experts who said competition should not resume for at least 6 weeks because of the coronavirus outbreak. The Florida High School Athletic Association Board voted 11-5 today to begin practices this month, although some counties with major outbreaks might choose to delay their seasons and forego participation in the statewide playoffs. Football games, other competitions could start September 4th, but the 67 countywide school districts plus private schools will have until September 18th to resume if they want to participate in those playoffs. The other fall sports affected, swimming and diving, cross-country, golf, bowling, and girls volleyball. The association's vote ignored the recommendations of its own medical advisory board, which called for not resuming sports until nearly the end of September, at the earliest. No county meets all the criteria that the board recommended for the resumption of sports. And the decision comes as Florida reported more than 6,200 new coronavirus cases and 200 deaths today. Over the past week, Florida has averaged 175 reported coronavirus deaths each day. Only Texas higher with 212. Students at a private school in California attended their second day of in-person classes today, despite state and county orders to close the school. Emmanuel Schools in Reedley was ordered to close yesterday after it reopened classrooms in violation of a state health order aimed at slowing the spread of the coronavirus. Fresno County also issued a health order against the school, ordering it to close its classrooms until the county is removed from a state monitoring list for 2 weeks. But news reports said students gathered in groups at the school for the first 2 days of the new school year without practicing social distancing or wearing masks. One parent told the Fresno Bee newspaper that it was the parents' right to send their students to class. Violating the order could lead to fines of up to $1,000 per violation per day. The order asks the county sheriff and local police chiefs to enforce the order. The private Christian school, located in the Central Valley, has about 600 students in classes from kindergarten through high school. In New York, nurses are warning that reopening that state's public schools for in-person classes risks spreading COVID-19 among students, their families, and school staff. Andrea Sears has the story.
The state has approved bringing students back to school this fall, although recent reports show young people are significant carriers of the coronavirus and can spread it to adults who are much more vulnerable to the disease. Judy Sheridan Gonzalez, president of the New York State Nurses Association, is concerned that the supply of personal protective equipment is inadequate and that schools haven't taken other important steps to ensure safe reopening.
There are issues of transportation that I don't think have been worked out. The isolation, are there needs for shields? How are people to eat? What would they do if they have a person who becomes positive?
The Nurses Association is calling on state and local officials to postpone in-person classes and to make the investments that would make classroom instruction safe. Sheridan Gonzalez says the rapid spread of COVID early in the pandemic showed that planning and preparation for a return to in-person classes needs the active participation of teachers, school administrators, and parents.
One of the many errors that took place in the hospital situation was that the direct caregivers were not involved in the planning and certainly were not given accurate information about what the preparation was.
She emphasizes that additional revenue also is needed to facilitate at-home learning for all students. Sheridan Gonzalez points out that the revenue would be available if New York lawmakers pass legislation to tax the types of income that benefit the state's wealthiest residents.
There are about 5 or 6 separate taxes that could generate billions of dollars of revenue for the state of New York to save hospitals from closing, to provide support for families who are paying rent or pay mortgages, create jobs.
She also wants Congress to pass the HEROES Act, which she said would help working-class New Yorkers and mitigate state and local budget shortfalls. For Public News Service, I'm Andrea Sears.
A federal judge threw out a lawsuit by an Arizona woman who claimed New York's 14-day quarantine requirement for travelers from hotspot coronavirus states infringed on her fundamental right to travel. U.S. District Judge David Hurd became at least the second federal judge to rule against challenges to the quarantines first ordered by New York Governor Andrew Cuomo in June. Alabama health officials are encouraged by a decline in coronavirus cases a month after a statewide mask order. State Health Officer Scott Harris says the numbers are improving, but he warns people should not abandon precautions heading into Labor Day gatherings and school openings. The 7-day average number for daily cases in Alabama has dropped below 1,000 after reaching 1,800 in mid-July. The number of hospitalized patients has dropped from about 1,600 to 1,400. The percent of positive coronavirus tests has dropped from over 16% to just about 12%. Harris encouraged people to keep wearing masks. He says the numbers may be declining because the surge of cases after the July 4th holiday has ended, and the statewide mask order in July played a role in lowering the numbers. Dr. Don Williamson, the former state health officer who heads the Alabama Hospital Association, says the next concern is a possible spike when students return to schools and colleges and gather for the Labor Day weekend. A judge has ordered a McDonald's restaurant in Oakland that was hit by a coronavirus outbreak to follow increased health and safety protocols to help stop the spread of the virus. The San Francisco Chronicle reports an Alameda County judge issued a preliminary injunction against the owners of the McDonald's in Oakland. Workers said the outbreak there infected 35 people. The judge ordered them to provide employees with masks and gloves and also required them to send home workers who show symptoms of infection. The Canada-U.S. border will remain closed to non-essential travel for at least another month. Today's announcement by Canada's Public Safety Minister Bill Blair came a day after Mexico announced a similar measure for its border with the United States. The land border restrictions aimed at controlling the coronavirus pandemic were first announced in March and have been renewed monthly. Many Canadians fear a reopening. Canada has flattened the epidemic curve, while the United States has more confirmed cases and deaths from COVID-19 than any other country in the world. You're listening to the Evening News on KPFA in Berkeley, KPFK in Los Angeles, KFCF Fresno, online at kpfa.org. You can listen to the newscast whenever you like, for as long as you like. There's an archived version of the news online. It's at kpfa.org. I'm Mark Miracle. About 1/3 of all Americans rent their homes. And a new report from the Aspen Institute shows the pandemic-related unemployment crisis could mean eviction for more than 40% of those households without additional relief measures. Roz Brown reports.
Nevada is behind only Alabama, where renters are the most vulnerable to eviction. Other top states for vulnerable renters include Oklahoma, Louisiana, and New York. Study co-author Sam Gilman says the loss of housing often ushers in serious legal consequences and suffering for families.
It leads to children not being able to go to school, homelessness, depression, and diseases of despair. An eviction upends everything in a family's life.
Nevada has created a rent relief program, but the state's $30 million in assistance relies entirely on federal funds, and stimulus talks have stalled in Congress. President Donald Trump circumvented Congress on Saturday by signing executive orders he says will deliver aid to Americans, including an eviction moratorium, but it's not clear if they're constitutional or substantive. The report shows that 37% of Nevada renters are at risk of eviction by the end of the year if conditions don't change. Gilman says some renters will be able to borrow money or work something out with their landlord, but eventually those options will be exhausted.
And at that point, that's when this pick your natural disaster metaphor, eviction, avalanche, tsunami, tornado will continue to start tearing through and accelerating through our communities.
According to Gilman, it's not just renters who will be affected, but also landlords.
Those mom and pop landlords are also severely at risk in this rental housing crisis, because if the renters can't pay rent, the landlords can't pay their mortgages, and we could see the acceleration of a rental housing crisis into a foreclosure crisis.
Gilman notes that Black and Latino Americans who already experience a greater risk of COVID-19 make up about 80% of those facing eviction. For Public News Service, I'm Roz Brown.
California will resume eviction and foreclosure procedures September 2nd, stoking fears of a wave of evictions during the coronavirus pandemic, unless the governor and the state legislature can agree on a proposal to extend protections. The Judicial Council of California voted 19-1 yesterday to end the temporary rules blocking such proceedings that had been in place since April 6th. Since the pandemic began in March, more than 9.7 million people have filed for unemployment benefits in California. A survey from the U.S. Census shows more than 1.7 million renters in the state could not pay their rent on time last month. California's Chief Justice Tani Cantil-Sakayui has been reluctant to let the rules stay in place much longer, saying it is the job of the judicial branch to interpret the laws, not to make them. In Washington today, members of the Congressional Black Caucus held a town hall with housing experts to discuss the looming eviction and foreclosure crisis in the aftermath of failed negotiations in the Senate on further coronavirus stimulus aid. Experts say the COVID-19 pandemic has only further intensified wealth disparities in the country, particularly for Black and Latino populations. And a surge of evictions will result in devastating public health outcomes without significant congressional intervention. KPFA's Chris Lee reports.
According to U.S. Census data, before the pandemic, more than a quarter of renters in the United States paid more than half of their income on housing. Renters are twice as likely to be seriously rent-burdened if they live in metropolitan areas, and the likeliness is yet greater if the renter is Black or Latino. Diane Yentl, CEO of the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, says structural racism compounded with the COVID-19 pandemic and subsequent job losses have disproportionately impacted people of color who are now on the verge of homelessness.
Federal, state, and local eviction moratoriums provided important protections for some renters, but they're expiring rapidly, and landlords and courts are beginning to evict. As of this week, 30 states have no eviction protections, and federal eviction moratoriums expired over 2 weeks ago. In places where eviction moratoriums have expired, evictions are increasing. Some communities were able to cobble together resources from the CARES Act to provide rental assistance and avoid some evictions, but many are having to shut down their programs within hours or days after the funds are quickly depleted.
Yentl says her organization is tracking emergent state and local emergency rental assistance programs. She says they have so far counted around 300 that have started in the last few months, and a quarter of them have already shut down due to lack of resources. Again, Yentl.
The one thing they all have in common is the extraordinary need, and the demand is far overwhelming resources throughout the country.
A study published by the Aspen Institute and the COVID-19 Eviction Defense Project estimates 30 to 40 million renters could be at risk of eviction if conditions do not change. Possible legislative solutions to avert the COVID-19 housing crisis have been sponsored by Democrats in both houses of Congress. A $1 billion proposal for rental and mortgage assistance was included in the HEROES Act, which passed the House back in May. An extension on the federal eviction moratorium, as well as the $600 weekly jobless benefit, was also included in the bill. Those provisions would stave off evictions, but the Republican majority in the Senate has rejected them in recent negotiations, which have ground to a halt. The Senate is now in recess until after Labor Day. Maxine Waters, Democratic chair of the House Financial Services Committee, says there is no time to waste.
It is difficult to underestimate the urgency of the current eviction and rental housing crisis for Black America and all of America. But unfortunately, Republicans in Congress and the White House are choosing to turn a blind eye to struggling families. They have insisted on a wait-and-see approach. But let's be clear, if we wait any longer, all we will see are more evictions, more homelessness, and a much larger economic recovery.
Waters says in her district, the city of Los Angeles announced its own one-time emergency rental assistance program. And she says the enrollment period shut down after just one day. Over 150,000 people applied, and only 50,000 were offered rent relief. Ayanna Fortson, director of the National Urban League's Housing and Community Development Division, says the HEROES Act needed to be passed yesterday. She says eviction is not just a condition of poverty, it produces poverty.
So what happens when you lose your home? We know you lose your house, but you're also losing community. They say it takes a village to raise a child, but we are losing our villages. We are losing our schools for our children. We are losing possessions as they're put on sidewalks. People lose jobs due to stress, due to the drawn-out process of evictions. We're gaining court records, and many landlords use that just to screen out future renters. So we're losing future potential homes.
I'm Chris Lee, reporting for KPFA.
The Democratic Women's Congressional Caucus held a hearing this week to urge the government to pass legislation that would increase wages for women who earn the lowest pay in the workforce. Daniel Whitty reports.
Women of color make up 2/3 of the minimum wage workforce. Many of these women perform essential jobs like home care and housekeeping. California Congresswoman Jackie Speer of San Mateo County is the co-chair of the Democratic Women's Caucus, which has 90 members. She says legislation is needed to level the playing field.
Women make up the lion's share of the essential workers, and of the essential workers, women of color, again, are of the highest percentage. So we need to do so much more, and I hope that as a result of today, we will have a new package of bills to introduce in the new year that will change the dynamic.
There are around 2 million home health care workers in the United States. Women make up 87% of them, and 62% are people of color. Irene Tung from the National Employment Law Project says that home care is one job that immigrant women feel is the entry-level job for them. Tung explains that the government needs to take action to solve the pay disparity. That includes greater oversight of the private companies that hire home health care aides.
So Congress could take action in a few ways. First, by making sure that home care employers receiving federal money do not violate existing wage and labor laws. And second, by ensuring that those employers respect workers' efforts to organize unions. And of course, we all know how important that is. So Medicaid-funded home care is particularly notorious for poor working conditions and widespread wage theft. And the federal government, as I said, pays for at least half of Medicaid costs in each state. Yet CMS provides no oversight with regard to what a private home care agency pays its workers or whether it complies with labor and employment laws.
The California Democratic Women's Caucus also discussed several bills in Congress they say will close the gap in women's pay in the workforce, including the Raise the Wages Act, which would increase the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour. They also say the Paycheck Fairness Act and provisions in the HEROES Act address gender pay disparities. For KPFA News, I'm Daniel Whitty.
After more than 2 years of browbeating and trade sanctions on Canada and Mexico, President Trump strong-armed the United States' neighbors into agreeing to supplant a 25-year-old North American trade agreement with one of his own. His pact, meant to update the old deal and encourage more manufacturing in the United States, was expected to restore clarity and predictability to the rules governing $1.4 trillion in annual U.S. trade with Canada and Mexico. The tranquility did not last very long, less than a month after Trump's U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement took effect on July 1st. The Trump administration is scheduled to reimpose a 10% import tax on Canadian aluminum on Sunday. The Canadians are poised to retaliate with tariffs on U.S. aluminum and other products. Trump's reimposed tariffs will raise costs for automakers and other U.S. manufacturers that use imported aluminum in their products. You're listening to the Evening News in KPFA Berkeley, KPFK Los Angeles, KFCF Fresno, online at kpfa.org.
Hey everyone, this is Brian Edwards-Teekert.
And I'm Kat Brooks.
Weekday mornings, we host Upfront.
2 hours of conversation about what's in the news and what should be.
Politics, technology.
Prisons, police.
What's happening in City Hall and at the State House.
In Washington and in the streets.
That's starting at 7 a.m., right after Democracy Now!
On Upfront.
A Georgia state trooper was fired and charged with murder today, a week after he shot a 60-year-old man who tried to flee a rural traffic stop. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation said in a statement that agents arrested Jacob Gordon Thompson, 27, on charges of felony murder and aggravated assault. The State Department of Public Safety said it fired Thompson, who had been a trooper for the Georgia State Patrol since 2013. The charges came a week after Julian Edward Roosevelt Lewis, 60 years old, was fatally shot following a chase in rural Scriven County, about 60 miles northwest of Savannah, Georgia. According to a news release from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, Thompson had tried to pull over a car for a traffic violation when the driver tried to flee. The agency said the trooper chased the vehicle down several country roads before performing a maneuver that forced the car to come to stop in a ditch. At some point afterwards, Trooper Thompson fired a single gunshot that hit Lewis, killing him. The trooper was not injured. No other details have been released. A Georgia Bureau of Investigation spokeswoman Nellie Miles said today that Lewis was black and the trooper was white. 3 Mississippi police officers have been charged with second-degree murder in the death of a black man last year. A Hinds County grand jury indicted the officers in the January 2019 death of 62-year-old George Robinson in Jackson. The indictment accuses the officers of willfully, unlawfully, and feloniously causing Robinson's death. The indictment says the 3 officers removed Robinson from his vehicle, body slammed him on the pavement, and repeatedly struck him in the head and the chest. A coroner said he died from bleeding on the brain caused by trauma to his head. Los Angeles County Sheriff Alex Villanova announced he's disciplining 26 employees for their involvement in a fight at an East Los Angeles police station involving a department clique called the Banditos. KPFK's Dan Fritz reports.
Villanova relieved the East LA station commander. 36 deputies have been transferred out of the station. Villanova said today that it's part of a new zero-tolerance policy.
After 20 months in office, I can now report that we are holding our employees accountable to the rule of law, and I will not tolerate any group of employees who mistreats any member of the community or another member of the department.
Deputy cliques or gangs, including the Banditos at the East LA station, have long plagued the sheriff's department. The LA Times reported this month that the county has paid out roughly $55 million in settlements in cases dating back to 1990. Dan Fritz, Pacifica Radio, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Georgia's Supreme Court is deciding whether 3 sheriff's deputies should be immune from prosecution in the 2017 death of an African-American man who authorities repeatedly shot with a stun gun. A judge last ruled that the 3 deputies were immune from prosecution after a district attorney charged the former Washington County Sheriff's deputies with murder in the case of 58-year-old Yuri Martin. The judge found the deputies' use of force against Martin was justified under Georgia's Stand Your Ground law. Prosecutors asked the High Court justices during a Thursday hearing to overturn the ruling and let an indictment brought by a grand jury proceed. Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey has announced plans to hold open an expected 100 police officer vacancies in next year's budget. His proposal came today in an address laying out his vision for next year's city budget. The mayor has opposed a majority of city council members who wanted to shut down the department after George Floyd's death in May and replace it with a new, more holistic public safety department. Suburban Atlanta's Stone Mountain Park, home of a giant sculpture of Confederate leaders, says it will close its gates tomorrow in the face of a planned right-wing rally. The event has sparked fears of violence, especially before an all-black militia said earlier this week that it would cancel plans to show up. Other groups were still planning to counter-protest. Pro-Confederate white supremacists and other right-wing groups had planned their event in response to a march by the Black Militia Group on July 4th. Last year, the park also closed down rather than allow a rally organized by white supremacists to go forward. The organizers were led by an Arkansas group called Confederate States 3%, which applied for a permit. But Stone Mountain Memorial Association spokesperson John Bankhead said the state denied the permit. The denial cited a violent clash between groups in April of 2016. Bankhead said the park will reopen on Sunday. On July 4th, mostly African-American demonstrators spoke out against the huge sculpture depicting General Robert E. Lee, Confederate President Jefferson Davis, and General Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson, carved into a granite mountain. The bas-relief sculpture is the largest Confederate monument ever crafted. Many of the 100 to 200 protesters who demonstrated on July 4th carried large rifles, but the demonstration was peaceful. California, 8 other states, and the Environmental Defense Fund are asking a federal judge to force the Environmental Protection Agency to act on pollution standards for landfills. California is home to the largest waste dump in the country, the Puente Hills landfill in the Los Angeles area. Suzanne Potter reports.
Decomposing solid waste in municipal landfills emits methane, a powerful greenhouse gas linked to climate change. Susanna Weaver, a lead attorney on the case, says the EPA has been dragging its feet for 3 years, claiming it needs time to align the standards with other future policies.
But it doesn't explain why it should retroactively extend these deadlines that should have been completely fulfilled many years ago were it not for EPA's unlawful actions to delay them.
In 2016, the Obama administration issued standards requiring each state to make a plan to mitigate air pollution from landfills or be subject to a federal plan. California's program requires municipal dumps to install methane capture technology. Weaver says landfills also emit benzene, a toxic pollutant that causes cancer, and volatile organic compounds that create smog.
The bottom line here is that these landfills emit hundreds of thousands of tons of dangerous pollution that should be controlled right now, but they haven't yet been implemented.
Meanwhile, on Thursday, the Trump administration reversed another Obama-era federal rule that limits methane emissions, this time from oil and gas facilities. For Public News Service, I'm Suzanne Potter.
Bone-dry vegetation fueled 3 wildfires near Los Angeles amid warnings today that the risk of new blazes erupting was high as temperatures spike and humidity levels drop during a statewide heat wave. A huge forest fire that prompted evacuations north of Los Angeles flared up this afternoon, sending up an enormous cloud of smoke as it headed toward the California aqueduct in the Antelope Valley. However, no new evacuations were ordered there. The fire was just 12% contained, and after threatening more than 5,400 homes, it had charred more than 18 square miles of brush and trees. Cooler overnight temperatures had helped firefighters increase containment, but the temperature hit 100 degrees today in the area, and the forecast called for continuing hot, dry weather with dangerous fire conditions because of possible gusty winds. Record-breaking heat is possible through the weekend with triple-digit temperatures and unhealthy air predicted for many parts of the state. Preliminary damage assessments found that at least 5 buildings burned in the Lake Hughes area north of L.A., but authorities said they believe more had been damaged or destroyed. There was no containment of a blaze that blackened foothills above the L.A. suburb of Azusa. It churned through nearly 4 square miles of brush yesterday and was moving away from homes. Evacuation orders issued to residents there were lifted early today. Another blaze came dangerously close to a neighborhood in the city of Corona, east of Los Angeles, before crews controlled it, and a Northern California fire in the community of Slough House near Sacramento burned about 500 acres before firefighters stopped its forward spread. Tomorrow, August 15th, marks the 75th anniversary of Japan's surrender in World War II, representing the formal end of that conflict, a global one that took up to 60 million lives. 75 years afterwards, more than 1 million Japanese war dead are still scattered throughout Asia, where the legacy of Japanese aggression still hampers recovery efforts. The missing Japanese make about half of the 2.4 million soldiers who died overseas during Japan's military rampage across Asia in the middle part of the 20th century. Japan will mark the 75th anniversary of its surrender, with the Emperor and the Prime Minister, Shinzo Abe, speaking at a national ceremony tomorrow. Meanwhile, an American survivor of the bloody U.S. invasion of the Japanese island of Iwo Jima is speaking out on the lessons from World War II, to be learned then and now. Suzanne Potter reports.
95-year-old retired Lieutenant J.G. Robert Pennoyer was just 19 when his unit helped occupy Japan's northern island of Hokkaido. He says it's a tribute to the Japanese culture that they were able to accept General Douglas MacArthur's help and transition to a democracy.
They were able to change and become a peace-loving nation. That was really a remarkable change. But getting control of the military, getting rid of the military, not letting the military dominate their foreign policy, that was the key.
Pennoyer says he was amazed at how well the Japanese people treated American soldiers after the war. A grandson of J.P. Morgan, he went on to become Assistant U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York under President Dwight Eisenhower and served on the boards at Columbia University and at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Pennoyer says although we had no choice in World War II, the U.S. has become too quick in recent decades to use military force to impose our will on other countries.
The trouble is not the military, but the civilian leadership in the White House who, because of the hubris about our power, misuse it and abuse it and take us into unjust wars like the Iraq War and Vietnam.
Pennoyer counsels greater use of diplomacy and says we should spend much less money on the military and much more on foreign aid and domestic concerns such as education. For Public News Service, I'm Suzanne Potter.
A judge says a Colorado woman accused of working with supporters of QAnon to have her son kidnapped from foster care can be put on trial. The judge admitted his decision was a close call because the prosecution did not definitively lay out Cynthia Absug's role in what authorities say was a scheme with supporters of QAnon, a far-right conspiracy theory. However, the fact that she bought a gun as the talks about the kidnapping raid were happening last year swayed him. The vast majority of the evidence in the case came from the woman's 15-year-old daughter to her therapist, a social worker, and police. Mostly sunny with highs near 80 degrees around the San Francisco Bay tomorrow. Further inland, the highs in the low triple digits. In the central San Joaquin Valley tomorrow, partly cloudy with a high of 108 degrees. Partly cloudy in Los Angeles tomorrow with highs in the mid-90s. And this programming note, the evening news will be preempted next week, Monday through Thursday, for coverage of the Democratic National Convention. No evening news Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday and Thursday of next week. Good evening.
This is a community announcement for August 2020. The dynamic Miss Faye Carroll offers an East Bay one-day workshop on Saturday, August 22nd from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. The one-day workshop includes group singing, harmony, improvisation, games, and a chance to win exclusive Faye Carroll apparel. Face coverings and spatial distancing are mandatory. Space is limited. For details and to apply, contact Ms. Carroll at faycarrollbiz@gmail.com. This community announcement is produced by the First Voice Apprenticeship Program. Please send your event for consideration to calendar@kpfa.org. You can hear this announcement again at 848-6767, extension 621, or view it online at kpfa.org.